Well, thank you for the long introduction. Fortunately, I prepared a slightly longer discussion. I think the only thing that's really relevant of the description given is that I'm a sociologist, so some of these techniques that have been discussed here were quite new to me, and I'm still not sure that I actually fully understood them, but at least it gives me the opportunity to ask questions about them. Well, I certainly, I should say that I received, I had a presentation and also a paper that I think overlaps with the first part, maybe even in greater detail. So I've learned quite a few things about Belgium. I'm not an expert about the Israeli system, but as we heard and things that I know, I mean, there are some similarities, and I suppose similarities with many other countries. And it did seem to me that the issue of the young average age at which people retire in Belgium is sort of the crucial issue in terms of the burden on the system and what can be done about that. Clearly, also. There's more than one paper here. I mean, there's certainly one, maybe even more than one, but one paper that deals with focuses more on the disability insurance and its role in this system. And then the second question I'll get to a bit later, which we saw towards the end about the sort of the incentives. The question, the first issue about the disability insurance and its role, and especially its relationship to the other systems, as was described here. The term used here was communicating vessels in terms of absorbing the shock. I suppose in parenthesis I should add that the metaphor is sort of not strictly appropriate, because sort of at least the physics of communicating vessels says essentially that no matter what the shape and the size, that the level of all the vessels would be the same at the end. And of course, what we saw here is that with all the changes, I mean, the disability component is a rather small one. So we're talking sort of an approximation of whether one has an effect on the others, or changes in one would in any way affect the others. And I suppose in many respects this is not a surprise that what we're dealing here with a situation. I mean, if we take the individual of losing one's job at, say, an early age or early their retirement age, both the individual and the system we try to find ways of sort of coping with this situation. So if there's a potential for disability, that may be one way. If there's this unemployment, as we saw here, that would be another way. It would be difficult for a system to have a situation where many find themselves without a job with no social protection. So I think in that respect, any system would have to find these solutions that would make it possible to adjust the situation. But I think it's interesting to ask whether the disability insurance is the one that would absorb, and what would that mean about the definitions of disability. I should add here that although there were three sort of regimes that were discussed, it wasn't always clear to me whether the actual figures are only for the private sector employees, or actually sort of over all the individuals. It wasn't always clear whether we're focusing on the one system that's most relevant or not, but that's sort of a side effect. So we saw here that I think my interpretation was, and I'm certainly less expert with respect to Belgium, is that by and large the disability system or the use of the disability insurance was quite stable, so it would have very minor sort of effects. I think that was also described here. Although I suppose the way the administration calculates it, or administrative calculation, would give a slightly different picture. I was especially interested with the point about mental illness. One interpretation I think you mentioned is that mental illness is more fuzzy, so it's supposedly easier to play around with if you want to get into that category, as opposed to some physical condition that usually has more objective signs. The other thing, but I think another explanation is, of course, that the changing characteristics of work-related illnesses and the movement from work environments and work situations that are physically harsh to work environments that are more mentally demanding or social mentally demanding, which have a potential for affecting one's mental health. And I think that's particularly true for women, may certainly play a role here. So it's quite possible that what we're seeing is real change in that rather than a full sort of absorbing other states. The second issue, if I would move on here, is the issue of incentives, or maybe it's disincentives, if I sort of understood the argument in terms of affecting the decisions to leave the labor force, and this is using the share data as was described here. I have a few comments. They're more, I suppose, questions than real comments. One is the relationship to health. My knowledge of share is that the health indicators are asked at a given, or with reference to a specific time that has to do with the survey period. But the information you have on retirement, for people that may have even retired prior to the survey itself, they may have been in a state of retirement when they were. So the question is, how does one relate to this? Is this a simple indication of what his previous state of health was, or, of course, a possibility that after retirement people have decline in health or whatever. So just a clarification of how that works. I actually saw a paper of, I don't know if they're colleagues or not, but no, it's not colleagues, but they did use Belgian data. Piccola and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing, Desriver, I think is the name. They wrote a paper comparisons, and for Belgium they actually used data on hospitalization as a health indicator, and maybe with a share of life it actually is possible to have information about hospitalization prior to retirement as one way of addressing this issue of temporality. Regarding the utility of an additional period of work, I'm a sociologist, so one of the things that I would have considered there is the issue of job satisfaction. Because that would be something that, now the problem with share is that you have job satisfaction for those who have a job, and not for those who at the time of the survey had already retired. So I don't really have a good solution for that, except that I suppose, or I hope that in the near future, one could use a panel structure of the share data to actually get at a more sort of a better angle on this issue. You mentioned actually that one of the advantages of share that it has wealth data, but at least I think in the models you have here you don't include wealth, and it would seem to me that one's accumulated wealth at the time of the decision would have relevance to whether an additional period of work would actually be an incentive or not. What they have now may make the difference. So, you said you tried various models, so it may be something you tried. As a final sort of point for someone that, my understanding of the what you call the option value, which I suppose economists know that, but I didn't. I mean, it's you need a lot of data for that, or essentially a lot of data with quite a few assumptions, and I wonder how sensitive it is to the assumptions that you actually used there, and with other assumptions you wouldn't get that sort of strong an effect. And it's very data heavy in terms of what information you need. And I wonder whether I had a paper recently, or did a, actually it was last year that we presented something about it wasn't retirement, but it was the interest in retirement, whether people wanted to retire or planned to retire earlier than the final. And we use information simply about, with regard to two things: their current income, these are all people that were still working, and the number of years that they've been with the previous employer. The actual current income did not really have an effect, but the period of time it did have an effect. So some of the information you take is gathered over the entire period, and I wonder whether these are two different factors that may affect it, and you sort of aggregate all of them into one. So these are my comments, questions, and I thank you for a very interesting paper.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting paper and interesting discussion. You both essentially point out that there are many people aged 50 to 64 who are not working, and that in order to support themselves, they find their way into one or another mechanism to keep themselves going. My question is, do we have any way of knowing, is it those who don't work, and whichever way they find to support themselves, is it because they don't want to work, or because the employers don't want to employ them?
Okay, thank you. I will continue. Again, thank you for the interesting presentation. And I will continue because one of my point is that you mentioned, and I agree completely, that the retirement age is not enough. But I think that retirement age has a symbolic meaning. And it's continuing that because the age that you are thought as being productive is all the time lowering. And I think that symbolic of postponing the retirement age maybe it's not the best mechanism to provide incentives, but it is a good mechanism for society to understand that people aged 65, 70 are can still be very productive. And just a question that I have. When we present data on the retirement age, or in the actual retirement age, there's never a presentation of the actual entrance to a labor market. And I think it's important also the number of years that people work to understand the stress on the system. As the initial, the entrance into formal labor market has been postponed over the years. So therefore, you work for very few years. If there's early retirement and you start working at the age of 30 in the formal market, so you have like 20 years to really accumulate any, and also to support those that are not working. So I was wondering if you have any kind of data.
Yeah, just one remark to your last comparison, Belgium, the Netherlands. So Belgium is going up, which basically means going down politically, whereas the Dutch disease of the 80s and 90s was turned into this miracle. Actually, when I look at the figures you put, it seems to be stock data, not flows, but the flows are much more impressive because it went down from 100,000 a year to 34,000, which is really 2/3 of the new influx of disability kind of miraculously disappeared, whereas when you look at stocks, it's much less. So I think the real dimension, the scale of the Dutch miracle is underestimated in your.
Looks like the baton is making a sibuv, circulating. My interest, and I'll be talking tomorrow about this, is really in phased retirement, which to me seems like a much more natural evolution from our current system to whatever the future holds. So just as an example, you know, someone goes from working 5 days a week, couple of years later 4 days a week, couple of years later 3 days a week. That to me seems a lot more natural than all or nothing. You know, sudden stop, as we say. It seems from what you're describing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's an all or nothing proposition in Belgium.
I have a question about the information content. We know, and Rabbi Dayan said it in the first, in his opening remarks, about that people are not aware of the rights and the benefits, etc., etc. And in this kind of idea of incentives, the assumption is that 100% of the people know what is going on. I would like to know what your reaction to that is.
Okay, so let me start from the beginning. And the first one was, I think, one of the first notes that I took was on, you know, it's societies find ways to actually keep people without, I mean, with positive income rather than having them drop to zero. That's true. Just, I mean, as I mentioned, there is also a social assistance component, quite a developed social assistance component. So it's not a necessary choice that you would, for example, in the Belgian context, have such a strong role for other programs, because the social assistance for elderly people is relatively developed. Now, in terms of the statistics, the ones on disability insurance and unemployment are indeed for the private sector workers, just simply because public sector workers can't be unemployed. That's so, and also in addition, actually, the public sector does not have statistics on disabled civil servants. So there are no separate statistics available on that one. They are now slowly starting to compile them, but they are sometimes, I mean, at least some anecdotal cases are rather embarrassing, and that's why it's. Then in terms of the mental health issue, I mean, indeed there is. I mean, there are these two reasons. I mean, it's not only the fuzziness of the mental health argument that is a driver. It's also obviously something else, and that's why I also mentioned this split, this breakdown for white and blue collar workers, and also men and women, because you really see that for women it is, I mean, a different kind of diagnosis that is the main one than for men. But it is also true that it is for women. That the other doors are more closed. So it's like, I mean, so you would also expect them to be the most interested in a way in that. But I fully take your point. It's not a pure choice. It's not a pure fakeness. There is something else going on in there. Then, in terms of the disincentives discussion you had, so regarding share, actually the health indicators, it's a bit different than it's not the whole population that we look at. It's not people who are already retired at the first interview. It's actually people who are not retired. So people who are working still. So that's the selection criteria. So actually, the health indicator is the health indicator of those who are still working. And so the health indicator we use is some kind of a construct of like a series of primary indicators. So it's a constructed health indicator. The point on job satisfaction, actually, I think it's a very very good one, because that's something we looked at some point a couple of years back on at the influence of general satisfaction with life and general health, and there we didn't find much. Quite frankly, I think on this time we basically disregarded it, but I will check that once I'm back in Liège, and if I find something interesting, I will let you know, because that's something I think we did not check again here in this thing. Regarding the advantages of share, I mean, sure, wealth is an advantage, wealth data, but also education data. So, I mean, we did play around with also like, do you own a house or do you not own a house, and information like that, which in the administrative data we don't have, and we also in the administrative data we don't have any education information, whereas in here you have at least something. So that's a point. On option values, I fully agree with you. There is a lot of assumption issues going on, and there is a lot of things there. Let's put it this way. I mean, we checked a few variants, like moving away, for example, from an option value setting towards more like of a pure financial present discounted value kind of aspect, where we looked only at the incentives of the pension system alone, rather than putting it into a utility framework. So rather than looking at this utility of leisure versus work, just sticking in these financial indicators, which is one way of generalizing. And there we found the same thing. Now, I agree with you. There is an issue of the length of the career, like and like this average lifetime income versus the current one. Here we don't have the information to really do much about it. We worked on that a few years back with some administrative data where we did have the way to look at it, and it actually turned out that it was really the lifetime one that was the more important one rather than the current income. Now, for the other comments, let me see. I have one which was, I mean, do people not want to work, or do they, do the companies not? Yeah, it's a good question. If you ask a trade unionist, then they would obviously say they would want to work, but they can't. And I'm sure there is a large degree of that going on. But in a way, it's also, I mean, there is a correlation. So between even if people would want to work, say, for example, in this Antwerp Opel factory that closes, just to take one big example, there are others. Indeed, financial incentives are such that people would also, if they were offered this package, most of them would actually leave, because just simply it's very generous. So in some ways, this collective negotiation thing could given that it's a negotiated outcome, so it's not each worker that decides, but it's still the trade unions that decide also on his behalf to a certain degree. So, I mean, I agree, it's both. It's not pure individual incentives, for sure not, but it's a mix, I think, and so it's true. So in a way, when you look at these results, it's not that it's the only explanation and it's the exclusive explanation, but it's one explanation, one indicator. On the retirement age point, that it's a good focal point, also for social, from a social point of view, to increase the retirement age rather than not. I think that's true, but it has to be also. It has to make sense. So, for example, in our system, increasing the retirement age, for example, for wage earners, doesn't make any sense unless you reform the early retirement programs first. Because if you increase the normal retirement age, just what will happen is that people will just spend this extra time on the other programs still. So, I mean, you first have to fix that problem, because that is the main one. And so, again, you could actually, in the limit, make it worse than better. Just simply because these imputations there of earnings play out quite some. And that also relates to this question, how long do people actually work And that's also relating to the statistic I quoted earlier on. 25% of days that count towards retirement are not non-work days, and so that includes for some people study time, that includes early retirement time, and that includes sick leave and so on during the working time. So I mean these things play out, and indeed the entry became later, and we are also are a country where youth unemployment is very high. So it's both. So we have very early exit and very late entry, and selective entry of people only into the labor market. And then on the phased retirement issue, no, the Netherlands, yes, the flows are much more impressive than the stocks. That's for sure. Because the Netherlands, indeed, they tightened the entry rather than forcing people out. So it's like it's really the inflow that declined dramatically, not the outflow of the system. On the phased retirement issue, I think. I mean, there is an option to have phased retirement. You can actually decrease your work schedule from 5 days to 4. And it is also an interesting one, but it's not the most interesting option that you have. So in a way, it is more like a categorical kind of decision that you have. You can continue to work also while receiving some of these retirement benefits, but it doesn't really help, again, for the financial survival of the system, given the way it's set up. So it's I guess to make phased retirement an option to solve, let's say, some financing issues in the retirement system, you first have to change the way the retirement system is financed. So it's just right now, I think phased retirement would not necessarily be bringing any a lot of good. And then just for the last point, I think, which was the one, do people know? I mean, are they aware of the options? I think in these things, on these public retirement options, I think they're quite aware. So, I mean, people are quite aware of what they can, what are the options there, and you would also see that, for example, you have strategic transitions from unemployment into disability scheme. So essentially, in both cases, you're inactive, but people are aware that under some circumstances it makes sense to switch at a certain point in time. So we see actually in official data that people are taking these decisions, to change status, and people are also pretty much aware of these options that are open to them. Now, we obviously don't know exactly who is eligible for what, and that's why we are taking this weighted approach. But in the reality, obviously, not everybody is eligible for this conventional early retirement, for example. So, in reality, the ones who are possibly eligible will know about it. So, I mean, the awareness of, like, what are your options and what are the financial consequences of it are quite known by the people. I'm not sure whether that was what you, or whether you had something else in mind.
Well, I know from in Israel there is an incentive to retire later, that you get higher. In Israel there is a if you retire later than the normal age for our Social Security, National Insurance, then you get a 5% increase in Social Security. And, people talk to me and they ask me, and this. And many people are not aware that if they do this, they will get this. If they do this, they will get this.
Actually, we have a similar system also, that you will get X euros more if you work one more year and so on. But actually, people are very much aware of it. I mean, this is something that was heavily publicized also, and but nobody really does it because it's not very interesting. So to do it, and there are only a few categories that actually. I mean, there have been some studies of who actually does these delayed retirement credits. Who actually gets them, and it's totally not the population that they wanted to have working longer, but it's rather some special categories of civil servants, for example, or some special categories of public sector workers who would be able to do that, but not even in the same objective. So I think I think overall people are aware of the system, and also when people ask me, like, what shall I do, or show me, like, their earnings history, well, very often the answers are very categorical, because it's not like very often not a marginal thing. You don't want to decrease work by 1 day. You actually want to go for the 0 or the 1. That's overall the incentive. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.